We're speaking to our friend Katyana Azman again. She's a child psychologist, and today we're speaking about how to talk to our children about puberty. Thank you so much for joining us again, Katyana. When do you know it's the right time to talk to your child about puberty? Are there any like telltale signs that we know that this is the time that we should talk to our children?
I think this is a very tricky question, because I think that, unlike a lot of other things, there isn't like a specific age group or specific age that parents should be like, okay, my kid just turned 5, time to have that chat, So it really depends on a couple of factors. But the one thing, and I did a little bit of extra research just to make sure that I wasn't kind of missing anything. And one of the main things that comes across is it really is advisable for parents not to wait for their child to come to them and use that as a sign, right? So oftentimes parents just be like, oh, wait until, my child has questions, or my child, comes back with a particular query, and then I will talk to them about it. Because there's been research that's been done that shows that quite a large proportion of children don't actually come forward with those questions, right? And so generally speaking, a couple of things that we have to consider is, of course, the child's level of development. So the general consensus that I came across was to try to have these chats with your kids when they're about 8 years old. So sort of like mid-primary is kind of the age where conversations should start, and definitely earlier for girls than for boys. So for boys, you could probably wait maybe a year or so different, but for girls, because generally speaking, girls do achieve puberty or reach puberty faster than boys. And so they don't, you don't want kids to be, especially with girls getting their period and things like that, it can be a very frightening incident for kids if they're not prepped beforehand. So a lot of the literature that I came across did advise to have that chat as soon as you can, so that your child is prepared, but not so soon that your child won't understand what you're trying to say. So don't try having the puberty talk with your kid and they're like 2 or 3 years old. It's not going to register. So, upwards of about 7 to 10 seems to be kind of the comfortable bracket. And it also depends on how mature your child is with communication. So if your child, for example, has a developmental delay or a cognitive delay, that might also impact their ability to comprehend what you're trying to tell them. But that seems to be sort of the general age bracket. Yeah.
Okay. Like you said earlier, girls reach puberty much sooner generally compared to boys.
Yeah.
But should our approach with both genders be different when it comes to this topic?
Well, I think that there are slight differences just strictly based on what the children would respond to, right? But in terms of the context, it seems to be relatively the same. So all of the guidelines that we've been told and that I've looked up basically talk about explaining to kids the types of changes that will be happening in their body. So for girls, what will be happening to their body, for boys, what will be happening to their body, but to kind of approach it in a sort of customizable way depending on your child's personality, and also whether heart-to-heart conversations are normal with your child. Because I've been, having conversations with parents where with boys, they might not really be open to having heart-to-heart conversations as much. And so sitting your son down and being like, son, we need to talk about something might come across a bit odd. So,
foreboding.
Yeah, any child would just be like, I don't know what I've done, what have I done?
Yeah. No, I mean, look at a boy going like, okay, what in the world are you trying to talk to me about, right?
Exactly. And it is it is an uncomfortable topic for both parents and children. And I think what's also really important to note is, when I was doing all this research and looking for all these guidelines, all of these guidelines were created contingent on the fact that kids are getting the education at school. And as we know, in Malaysia, sex education is something that we're still kind of, not really doing very well. Most of the time there's a talk. I remember when I was in school, girls kind of get carted off, and then we get to talk about your periods, and they give you a whole stack of pads. And that's pretty much the extent of what I was exposed to, but the boys got a free period. So the boys didn't get much that day, but the girls got the talk. So I feel like from experience and from hearing from my kids or from my clients, sex ed is not really something that we're doing quite sort of like in a standardized manner over here. So there are all these guidelines where they said, have a chat with your kid's teacher to understand what are the gaps that are missing and what the school's been telling them. But I think here in Malaysia, you might very well be the only person who is telling your child about sex education and about puberty. So that is something that is really, it's more important than ever for parents to be able to have these conversations with your kids, because they're not getting it anywhere else, right?
Yeah.
So the general guideline is, just try not to make it a very frightening conversation. Try not to make it a very scary one. The goal is that they will feel comfortable to come to you with questions, asking, why is this happening? Why is that happening? Why does my body look like this? And for you to be able to approach it in as open a manner as possible, and customize it based on what are the ways that you normally talk to your child, boy or girl, and then go from there. But try to stay away from the scary, terminology and all the medical jargon that you Google on the internet. Try to kind of stay away from stuff like that, and just have like a very simple conversation using very simple language terms, and it should be fine.
Question: should a dad talk to the son about boy stuff and then a girl, the mom? Should it be separated that way, or should
Well,
it be mom and dad?
I think that in just terms of comfort, that's generally what's being done, and there hasn't really been any research or evidence to show that there's a problem with going sort of with your same gender parent to have these chats. And I think that it's also for convenience, because I've had some single dads having to have the puberty talk with their daughters, and it's often very not strange, but difficult for them, because they're like, I don't actually know what period feels like. Dads tell me, like, I don't actually know what period feels like. I know the science, but I don't. So sometimes that might be easier just for dads to talk to boys and girls, moms to talk to girls. But what I did find, which I also, which is really enlightening, is that it is also encouraged for parents to tell their children about what puberty is like for the opposite gender. So if you have a son, tell them about what happens in puberty for girls and what they're going through, right? Give them a very basic outline of what periods are, and then for girls, the same thing with boys and sort of puberty and their voice breaking and all of that stuff, and that's just to kind of encourage a more respectful sort of conversation, because the other topic that we do have to talk about, and this is something that we teach with younger children versus older children, is things like appropriate touching, safe touching, and things like that. And so these are all things that we kind of have to navigate with our children, because one of the articles I was reading was saying that we live in a very different time, where even if we're not wanting to have these conversations with our kids, the internet probably has done it for us. Or media or television. So we kind of, as parents, have to get ahead of it, and we do have to advise them on stuff like this. So yeah.
But is it possible for a parent to overshare? Is there anything that we say that's appropriate, or is there, like, what's appropriate to say and what's not?
What not to freak them out, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely overshare, right? So, for me, if I had to kind of structure it out, I would kind of focus more on sort of the body changes of puberty that come with puberty when you're talking to your 8-year-old or your 9-year-old, because those are the types of things that would be pressing at the time. And once they kind of reach, in their teens, and we're talking about sexual behavior, then you can kind of have another conversation where, okay, now that you're kind of growing up, there's a couple of things that we have to talk about, being safe and blah, blah, blah. Those are the types of things that I would kind of reserve for when they're a slightly older, just because you could run the risk of oversharing, and they'll just be like, what are we talking about? Like kind of come across if you're dealing with a 7 or 8-year-old. So yeah, I would kind of go with that structure.
But if we don't talk to them about puberty, right, are there going to be any negative repercussions? Like, so we just let them go through life on their own, or go through puberty on their own?
I think that there is absolutely a risk for it kind of working out badly, because again, like, if you're not telling your daughter that at a certain age you're going to start bleeding, right? And in a pretty frightening place for bleeding to take place, you could run the risk of developing some type of traumatic response. If we're not telling, boys, for example, of what happens to girls, they'll often kind of, there's been cases where kids get teased at school because, girls stain their skirts or stain their shorts, and then you kind of have to deal with that. But then I think, that's kind of one side of it, but the part of it that I'm more concerned about is sort of what happens when they're not equipped with this information and they try to find it out themselves. Because these conversations are happening amongst kids, they are happening in school. Like I said, social media, even just TV shows in general are now a lot more open, talking about sexualized topics and puberty and all of that. And so we can't stop the fact that our kids are going to be just naturally very curious about it as they grow. And if they're not, and I've had this conversation with a lot of children who come from very conservative, very strict families where this topic is taboo, especially anything to do with sexual behavior they don't talk about. And that tends to end with them using the internet or using sort of other sources to find out. And that could lead them down a path that we don't really want them going down, or them getting information that's probably not so great, introducing them to sexual behavior and things like that in a more skewed negative way. And I mean, kind of with pornography or sexual grooming and all of that sort of dark, twisty stuff. So I always say that if parents can set a tone in their household where kids know that these topics are discussable, if that's a word, you can kind of ask parents about this, then that's the tone you want to set, because you are the only two adults that really are able to do so with the child's best interest at heart. If your kid is getting it from the outside or from another adult in the outside world, then they could, it could kind of run the risk of it being negative. So try to be the ones who set the tone for your children.
But Asian culture, though, nobody actually does the talk.
But if the
right?
parents are really uncomfortable with not only doing the puberty talk and the sexual talk, right? Can we get like books or make them watch certain videos, that are approved to instead of just having the talk with them?
No, absolutely. You can use a lot of, sometimes it's really helpful also depending on how old your child is. If your child is on the younger side, videos and books and stuff like that might actually be a more gentle way of introducing them to these topics. But you still need to kind of have that window where, okay, so there's a couple of stuff that mommy and daddy want to talk to you about because now you're growing up. So there's a couple of videos and books and stuff that we bought for you to kind of make this easier. But if you have any questions, we're going to talk about it later. So you need to be able to give them that window where, if there are stuff that confuse me, and I'm sure there will be, I can always go to them to talk about it. So that still needs to be there. I get that it's a terrifying thing to sit your child down and have that conversation. So, if it would be easier to use, books and stuff, go ahead, but still make sure that there is at the very least that window with which they can kind of come to you if they need to. But that's what I.
So we have to tell them, these are the books that you can read, these are the videos that you can watch. But if you have any questions, please do come to mommy or daddy to ask.
Yeah. And if you can stomach it, be there, do it with them. Like read the books with them, watch the video with them. Because a lot of times they might just feel just very ashamed or uncomfortable and they don't really want to ask. And so what that means is that they'll probably ask their friends later on. And their friends are probably not as well versed as you are. So we kind of want them to feel comfortable despite it being an uncomfortable topic.
I was just thinking about it because it's a very terrifying talk. I'm like, who's more terrified, the kids or the parents? Because the parents are like, right?
Yeah, probably the parents. Yeah,
because you don't want to say the wrong thing, and then there's the possibility of oversharing. What if they don't understand? And then if they get curious, and what do you do?
Well, I have to say that it wouldn't. It's not unheard of parents to actually partner up with their pediatrician or their psychologist to actually have the chat, because they're worried about doing it by themselves. So I have had a couple of my clients where the parents have said, we're kind of struggling with the birds and the bees talk, and we're kind of struggling with kind of explaining to her about periods and stuff. Do you think that you could kind of help us with that or kind of have that chat with her. So I've had that task kind of pawned off to me a couple of times, but at the end of the day, I always say to the kids, after my little introduction with them, I say, I know all of this stuff is really confusing. So if you have questions or if something doesn't make sense, make sure you go to mommy and daddy and ask, and they'll be able to help you. So I've kind of made sure that bit is kind of with them. But
Yeah. Now, Katyana, what other advice would you give to parents about talking to their children about puberty?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, it's so important, especially in Malaysia, for parents to be able to have these talks, because your kids are not getting it anywhere else. It's not part of the school curriculum, which means that they're only getting it, via the internet. And as we know, those sources might not be reliable and might even be dangerous depending on where they're going. So have these chats with your kids, despite how uncomfortable it is. There is no set timeline, but of course, before puberty would be good, because at least you're preparing them rather than doing damage control. And there are a lot of resources via the internet. Your pediatricians probably have brochures and information about it, to actually prepare you for this conversation. So it's not something that you have to have unprepared and kind of struggle and do stuff like that. But definitely something that's super important to have with kids, because we want to be able to not just have them look at puberty as a normal, not say positive, but normal thing, right? But for them to also start off their life and exploring sexual behavior in a positive and healthy way. And those are the things that we kind of have to set the tone for.